The morning sun peeked through the blinds of a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. David Carter squinted at his laptop screen, the bright light of his coding program the only illumination in the room. At 32, he hadn't planned on living in this modest one-bedroom place, but every extra dollar went back into his company. The sacrifice was worth it. 5 years earlier, David had been just another college graduate with big dreams and bigger student loans. The son of a bus driver and a nurse, he'd grown up watching his parents work long hours to provide opportunities they never had. Their dedication had pushed him to excel in school, especially in computer science, where he discovered a natural talent for understanding complex systems. One more bug to fix, he muttered to himself, fingers flying across the keyboard. His latest security software update needed to be perfect before tomorrow's pitch meeting. What had started as a side project in his parents' basement had grown into CyberShield Solutions, a company that now employed over 200 people and was changing how everyday people protected their personal information online. The journey hadn't been easy. David remembered those early days, sending out hundreds of emails to potential investors, most of which went unanswered. He remembered the polite rejections, the skeptical looks, and the doors that seemed to close before he could even knock. "You have an interesting concept," one investor had told him after a particularly grueling presentation. "But I just don't see the market for it." 3 months later, a major data breach at a popular social media company proved David's concerns were not only valid but urgent. His phone started ringing, and it hadn't stopped since. David stood up and stretched, his back sore from sitting too long. The small apartment kitchen beckoned, and he made himself a quick cup of coffee. As the machine hummed, he glanced at the framed photo on his counter, a group picture from the opening of the first community tech center his company had funded in his old neighborhood. The tech centers were his passion project. Growing up, David had been lucky enough to have a teacher who recognized his potential and gave him access to the school computer lab during lunch and after classes. Not everyone had that opportunity. Now, with his company's success, he made sure to create those opportunities for others, especially in neighborhoods where tech education was limited. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from his chief operating officer, Lynn. "Don't forget about the TV thing tomorrow. Car picking you up at 7 a.m. Please get some sleep." David smiled. Lynn was always looking out for him, trying to make sure he didn't burn himself out. The TV thing was his upcoming appearance on Rise and Shine America, one of the country's most popular morning shows. The producers had reached out last month, interested in featuring him as part of their series on innovation in America. At first, David had been hesitant. He preferred working behind the scenes, letting his products speak for themselves. But his PR team had convinced him this was a chance to reach millions of people who might benefit from better understanding digital privacy. Plus, it was an opportunity to show young people from backgrounds like his that there was a place for them in the tech world. David finished his coffee and returned to his laptop, saving his work and closing the program. Lynn was right, he needed sleep. Tomorrow would be a big day. The next morning came too quickly. David's alarm jolted him awake at 5:30 a.m., giving him just enough time to shower, shave, and put on the navy suit his stylist had selected for the appearance. He wasn't used to having a stylist, but the company's board insisted that as the face of CyberShield, he needed to look the part. The car arrived precisely at 7 a.m., and David settled into the back seat, reviewing some notes on his phone. His PR director had sent over likely questions and talking points, but David preferred to speak from the heart. He knew his stuff. He'd built this technology from the ground up. What he wasn't as comfortable with was the personal spotlight. "First time on national TV?" the driver asked, catching David's eye in the rearview mirror. "That obvious, huh?" David replied with a nervous laugh. "You'll do great," the driver assured him. "Just be yourself." The television studio was larger than David had imagined, bustling with activity even at this early hour. A production assistant greeted him at the entrance and whisked him through a maze of hallways to the makeup room. "We need to get you camera ready," she explained, introducing him to a makeup artist who immediately began dabbing foundation on his face. David had never worn makeup before and felt slightly ridiculous, but he understood the necessity. Under the harsh studio lights, everyone needed a little help looking natural. "Mr. Carter?" A new voice called from the doorway. A young man with a clipboard stepped into the room. I'm Ryan, one of the producers. We're so excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for having me, David replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Bradley Wilson, our host, is looking forward to meeting you. He's been briefed on your work and is particularly interested in your community initiatives. David nodded, relieved. That was a topic he could talk about comfortably all day. After makeup, Ryan led him to a small waiting area near the main stage. Through a monitor, David could see the show was already in progress. Bradley Wilson, the show's famous host, was interviewing a celebrity chef about an upcoming cookbook. Wilson was known for his charm and occasionally sharp questioning, but the interview seemed lighthearted. You'll be on after the commercial break, Ryan explained. Just follow Bradley's lead. He's a pro and will make you feel comfortable. David took a deep breath, mentally reviewing the journey that had led him here. From teaching himself to code on an outdated computer, to late nights developing his first security program, to pitching investors who couldn't see past their own preconceptions, to finally breaking through and building something meaningful. Whatever happened in the next 20 minutes, he had already accomplished more than many people had believed possible. A technician approached with a small microphone. I need to clip this to your jacket, she explained, efficiently attaching the device and running the wire discreetly inside his clothing. 30 seconds, someone called out. Ryan gave David an encouraging smile. Remember, millions of people will be learning about digital privacy because of you today. That's the important part, David nodded, straightening his tie one last time. And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The stage manager's voice trailed off as they counted down the final seconds silently, fingers in the air. The lights seemed to brighten, and suddenly David heard Bradley Wilson's voice. Our next guest started his company in his parents' basement just 5 years ago. Today, his cybersecurity firm is changing how we think about personal data protection. Please welcome the founder and CEO of CyberShield Solutions, David Carter. That was his cue. David walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily disorienting him. The studio audience applauded, and Bradley Wilson stood to shake his hand. Wilson's grip was firm, his smile practiced but welcoming. David, thank you for joining us this morning, Wilson said as they both took their seats. Thank you for having me, David replied, his voice steadier than he expected. So, tell us, Wilson began, leaning forward with interest. How does someone go from working in a basement to running one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country? And just like that, David found himself telling his story to America. The initial nervousness faded as he spoke about the problems he'd seen in digital security and his vision for fixing them. Wilson was an engaged listener, asking informed questions that allowed David to explain complex concepts in ways the audience could understand. When the conversation turned to the community tech centers, David felt himself truly relax. This was the work he was most proud of, creating pathways for young people who, like him, just needed access and opportunity to show what they could do. Last month, David explained, his voice warm with genuine enthusiasm, a 12-year-old girl at our Southside Center developed her own app to help elderly neighbors request assistance with errands. That's the kind of innovation we're missing out on when we don't provide resources to all communities. The audience responded with appreciative applause, and David noticed Wilson nodding thoughtfully. The interview was going better than he could have hoped. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that this appearance might actually inspire someone watching at home, someone who perhaps had never seen someone like him in this position before. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, the friendly conversation would take an unexpected turn, one that would test his composure and ultimately change the course of his public journey in ways he couldn't imagine. The studio lights felt warmer now as David settled into the rhythm of the conversation. Bradley Wilson had a gift for making his guests feel at ease, and despite his initial nervousness, David found himself genuinely enjoying the interview. The audience seemed engaged too, nodding along as he explained how everyday people could better protect their digital footprint. What I find fascinating, Wilson said, leaning forward slightly, is that you built all this without the traditional Silicon Valley background. No Stanford degree, no family connections in the industry? David smiled. That's right. I went to our state university on scholarship. Great education, but definitely not what most tech investors were looking for on a resume. And yet, Wilson continued, CyberShield has outperformed companies with 10 times your initial funding. What do you think you brought to the table that others missed? This was a question David had thought about many times. Perspective, he answered after a moment. Growing up where I did, you learn to spot vulnerabilities because sometimes your safety depends on it. When I looked at how companies were handling personal data, I saw the same patterns. Blind spots that seemed obvious to me but invisible to those who designed the systems. The audience murmured appreciatively, and Wilson nodded. Can you give us an example? Sure. David shifted forward, his passion for the subject overriding any remaining camera shyness. Most security systems are built assuming users have consistent internet access, up-to-date devices, and technical knowledge. But what about the grandmother using a 10-year-old tablet? Or the family sharing one computer? Or people using public Wi-Fi because they can't afford home internet? He gestured with his hands as he warmed to his subject. Those users were treated as edge cases, but they're actually millions of people. Our first product focused specifically on making security accessible for them, simple, light on resources, and designed to work even with spotty internet connections. That's what drove our early growth. People who'd been told they were too old or too non-technical to protect themselves online suddenly had tools that made sense to them. Wilson seemed genuinely interested. And now your company is valued at what, close to $1 billion? David laughed softly. The exact number changes day to day, but yes, somewhere around there. Not bad for a basement startup, Wilson quipped, earning chuckles from the audience. The basement was actually my parents' idea, David admitted. When I told them I was quitting my stable job to start this company, they insisted I move back home to save money. My mom set up a mini office for me in the basement, brought me meals when I worked late. Dad would come down after his shift and ask me to explain what I was building. David's expression softened at the memory, even when I was speaking what must have sounded like a foreign language to him. Talking about encryption protocols and vulnerability testing, he'd just listen and ask questions until he understood enough to be proud. They believed in me before anyone else did. The audience responded with appreciative murmurs, and David noticed a few people nodding in recognition of that kind of family support. Speaking of family, Wilson transitioned smoothly. I understand you're quite dedicated to giving back to the community you grew up in. Tell us about the tech centers you've been opening. This was David's favorite topic, and his face lit up. We've opened 7 so far, with 3 more in development. The idea is simple. Provide the same tools, training, and opportunities to kids in underserved neighborhoods that you'd find in the most privileged tech incubators. We hire local teachers and tech professionals who understand the community. We make sure the centers are accessible by public transportation. And crucially, everything is free. The equipment, the classes, the mentorship. Wilson raised his eyebrows. That can't be cheap. It's not, David acknowledged. We allocate 15% of our annual profits to the program. But I see it as our most important investment. The next generation of innovators is out there right now, just waiting for someone to put the right tools in their hands. He paused, gathering his thoughts. A few months ago, I visited our newest center in the neighborhood where I grew up. A group of teenagers showed me an app they were developing to help track and report infrastructure problems in their community. Broken streetlights, water leaks, that sort of thing. These kids were 14, 15 years old, and they'd identified a real problem and were building a practical solution. That's the kind of untapped talent we're trying to nurture. The audience applauded, and David saw several people exchanging impressed glances. Wilson waited for the applause to die down before continuing. It's certainly commendable work, he said. Now moving to your core business, cybersecurity is constantly evolving. What emerging threats should everyday Americans be most concerned about? For the next few minutes, David walked through recent developments in the digital security landscape. Careful to explain complex concepts in accessible terms, he outlined the rise in sophisticated phishing attempts, the vulnerabilities in smart home devices, and the growing threats to mobile security. The good news, he concluded, is that most of these threats can be mitigated with the right precautions. You don't need to be a tech expert to protect yourself, but you do need to use the right tools and develop some basic security habits. Wilson nodded. And I imagine CyberShield offers solutions for these exact problems? We do, David confirmed. But so do other reputable security companies. The important thing is that people take digital security seriously and find tools that work for their specific needs. Very diplomatic, Wilson commented with a slight smile. Though I notice you didn't mention your competitors by name. David returned the smile. Competition drives innovation. We're all working toward a safer digital environment, just taking different approaches to get there. Fair enough. Wilson glanced down at his notes, and something in his demeanor shifted slightly. If David hadn't been watching closely, he might have missed it. A subtle straightening of Wilson's posture. A barely perceptible change in his expression. You know, David, Wilson began, his tone still conversational but with a new edge to it. Your story is remarkable by any standard. The tech industry isn't exactly known for its diversity or for welcoming outsiders. David nodded cautiously, sensing the shift in the conversation but not yet sure where it was heading. In fact, Wilson continued, I was looking at some industry reports recently. He reached for a folder that had been sitting on the small table beside him. The numbers are pretty stark. Less than 3% of venture capital funding goes to Black founders. The statistics for C-suite positions and board memberships aren't much better. That's unfortunately accurate, David agreed. The industry has a long way to go. Wilson flipped open the folder. In light of those statistics, some people might wonder, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but some might question whether companies like yours benefit from a sort of positive discrimination, special consideration given to promote diversity rather than purely on merit. The studio grew noticeably quieter. David felt a prickle of awareness travel up his spine. The friendly interview was taking an unexpected turn. I've got some quotes here, Wilson continued, scanning a page in his folder, from an anonymous source in the venture capital world who suggests that firms like yours might receive funding as part of corporate diversity initiatives rather than based solely on the strength of your technology or business model. How would you respond to that? David could feel the weight of the cameras on him, the attention of the audience sharpening. The question hung in the air, its implications clear. This wasn't the conversation he had prepared for. This wasn't about his company's innovations or his community work. This was something else entirely. In the brief moment before he answered, David thought about all the paths that had led him to this studio, this chair, this question. He thought about the doors that had closed in his face, the assumptions he'd encountered, the extra work he'd put in to prove himself again and again. He thought about the young people in his tech centers who might be watching, who needed to see how to handle moments like this with dignity. The studio remained silent, waiting for his response. Bradley Wilson leaned forward slightly, his expression a practiced mixture of curiosity and concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. David took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would matter more than anything else in the interview. The silence in the studio seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality only a few seconds had passed. David felt a familiar sensation washing over him, the same feeling he'd experienced in countless boardrooms and investor meetings when someone wanted to test whether he belonged there. That's an interesting perspective, David finally said, his voice calm and measured. I'd like to understand more about these claims. Could you share which venture capital firms feel they've lowered their standards for companies like mine? Bradley Wilson seemed momentarily caught off guard by the direct question. He glanced down at his folder. I'm not at liberty to name specific sources, but the sentiment exists in the industry. I see. David nodded thoughtfully. Anonymous sources with unnamed concerns about unnamed companies. That's difficult to address specifically. A faint ripple of nervous laughter moved through the audience. Wilson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Let me try a different approach, Wilson said, shuffling through papers in his folder. Your first major funding round came shortly after several tech giants announced diversity initiatives. The timing seemed fortuitous. David took a slow breath. He could feel the interview slipping away from the substantive discussion of his work he'd hoped for. Part of him wanted to call out what was happening, but years of experience had taught him that showing frustration would only feed into certain narratives. Instead, he decided to address the question directly. Our Series A funding came 3 months after we demonstrated a working prototype that detected vulnerabilities other security programs missed, David explained evenly. It came after we showed early adoption rates triple the industry average. And yes, it came at a time when many companies were talking about diversity. He leaned forward slightly. But correlation isn't causation, as any good data scientist will tell you. The investors who backed us did extensive technical due diligence. They tested our product against competitors. They interviewed our early customers. They scrutinized our code architecture and our business model. Would you say that extra scrutiny is something all founders face? Wilson interjected. I can't speak for all founders, David replied. I can only tell you about my experience. And my experience is that every claim we've made has been verified, tested, and proven, often to standards beyond what others might face. Wilson nodded as if David had just proven his point. So you acknowledge there's a different standard? David paused, recognizing the verbal trap. This wasn't his first difficult interview, though it was certainly the most public. He reminded himself to stay focused on substance rather than getting pulled into a heated exchange. What I acknowledge, David said carefully, is that innovation can come from unexpected places, and smart investors know that. Our early backers saw potential where others didn't, and that decision has paid off tremendously for them. Our initial investors have seen a return of over 3,000% on their investment. Wilson seemed unmoved by the impressive figure. Let's talk about your encryption technology. Some industry experts have suggested that while effective, it's not as revolutionary as portrayed in the press. The abrupt change of topic was clearly designed to keep David off balance, but he was prepared. Years of defending his work had honed his ability to address technical criticism. I'd be happy to discuss the technical aspects of our approach, David replied. Which specific features are these experts questioning? Again, Wilson consulted his folder. The distributed verification system that forms the core of your security platform. Critics suggest it's simply a repackaging of existing technologies. David found himself on firmer ground now. That's a common misconception. If I may explain briefly, traditional security systems operate like a castle with a single gate. Break through that gate and you have access to everything. He used his hands to illustrate as he spoke. Our system is fundamentally different. We created a distributed approach where verification happens continuously across multiple points. There's no single gate to break through. This isn't a repackaging. It's a complete architectural redesign. The patent office agreed, he added. We now hold 17 patents on our core technology, with 12 more pending. Those patents have been cited by Google, Microsoft, and Amazon in their own security filings. That doesn't happen with repackaged technology. Wilson seemed to realize the technical discussion wasn't yielding the reaction he'd hoped for. He flipped to another page in his folder. Let's move to your company culture, he said. I understand your executive team is unusually diverse for the tech industry. That's correct, David acknowledged, bracing himself for where this might be heading. Our leadership team includes people from various backgrounds, genders, and experiences. We believe diverse perspectives lead to better problem solving. And what would you say to those who might suggest that your hiring practices prioritize diversity over qualification? Wilson asked, his tone suggesting he was simply raising a question others might have. A murmur ran through the audience. David noticed a young production assistant off camera looking uncomfortable. Even the camera operator seemed to shift slightly. I'd invite them to review the credentials of our team, David answered, keeping his voice steady despite the growing tension. Our chief technology officer previously led security at one of the world's largest banks. Our head of product development holds multiple patents in her own right. Our chief operating officer built and sold 2 successful companies before joining us. He paused to let that sink in. But I think there's a more fundamental issue with that question. It assumes that diversity and qualification are somehow opposing forces, that you can have one or the other, but not both. That's a false dichotomy. The reality is that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. When we expanded our recruiting beyond the usual channels, we didn't lower our standards. We raised the bar by accessing talent pools our competitors were overlooking. Wilson seemed determined to press the point. But surely you must acknowledge that your background gives you certain advantages in today's corporate climate. Companies are under tremendous pressure to demonstrate diversity. David felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. He had hoped this national TV appearance would focus on his company's technology, on the community centers, on digital security for everyday people. Instead, it had become yet another conversation about his identity rather than his work. Let me be clear, David said, his voice taking on a new firmness. Every entrepreneur brings different advantages to the table. Some have family wealth, some have Ivy League networks, some have previous exits that give them credibility with investors. What I brought was first-hand understanding of users that others were ignoring, technical skills I developed through years of dedicated study. And yes, Perspective from growing up in communities that tech has traditionally underserved. Wilson nodded with feigned thoughtfulness. So you're saying your background is an asset? Every founder's background shapes their vision, David replied. Mine shaped my ability to see gaps in the market that others missed. That's not an unfair advantage, that's entrepreneurship. Interesting perspective, Wilson said, in a tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He shuffled through his papers again. I have some quotes here from industry analysts suggesting that your company's valuation might be inflated due to social factors rather than technical merit. David felt his patience beginning to wear thin, but he kept his expression neutral. He was acutely aware of the cameras capturing every micro-expression, every shift in his posture. Which analysts are these? David asked. Wilson glanced at his notes. I have comments from several respected voices in the industry. Without names or context, it's difficult to address their concerns meaningfully, David pointed out. But I'm happy to discuss our valuation metrics. Our annual recurring revenue has grown at 112% year over year. Our customer acquisition cost is 37% below industry average. Our retention rate is 94%. He leaned forward slightly. Those aren't social factors, Mr. Wilson. Those are business fundamentals. Wilson seemed to sense that his line of questioning wasn't yielding the reaction he'd hoped for. David wasn't showing frustration or anger, just calm competence. The host decided to try a more direct approach. Let's be candid, Mr. Carter, Wilson said, setting his folder down. Many people watching might wonder if your success story, inspiring as it is, benefits from the current climate where companies are eager to support minority-owned businesses. Is it possible that doors opened for you that might have remained closed in a different era? The question hung in the air. The studio was completely silent now, the audience sensing they were witnessing something significant. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. David took a moment to gather his thoughts. He could feel the weight of this moment, not just for himself but for others who would face similar questions, who had faced them all their lives. He thought about the teenagers in his tech centers, about his parents watching at home, about young entrepreneurs who might see this interview. Wilson waited, clearly expecting either defensiveness or an emotional response he could use to steer the conversation further into controversial territory. The folder of research sat ready on his lap, prepared to supply more provocative questions. David looked directly at Wilson, his expression composed but resolute. The next few minutes would define not just this interview, but perhaps the public perception of his company and his work. Everything hinged on how he chose to respond. David took a slow, deliberate breath. The studio lights felt warmer than before, and he could sense the collective tension of the audience. He had faced variations of this question throughout his career, the implication that his success was somehow less earned, less legitimate than others. But never on national television, with millions of viewers waiting for his response. That's a thought-provoking question, Mr. Wilson, David began, his voice calm but carrying a new note of clarity and purpose. And I appreciate the opportunity to address it directly. He adjusted his position slightly, straightening his shoulders but keeping his demeanor relaxed. You're asking if doors opened for me because of what you call the current climate. I think what you're really asking is whether I've somehow had an easier path because of my identity, rather than my work. Wilson didn't confirm or deny this interpretation, but his expression suggested David had accurately captured the subtext. Let me walk you through some numbers, David continued. Before securing our first major funding round, my team and I were rejected by 87 venture capital firms. 87 no's before we got our first yes. He held up his hand, counting off on his fingers. During those rejections, we refined our product 6 times. We expanded our customer base from dozens to thousands. We improved our security protocols until they outperformed every competitor in blind testing. So when you ask if doors open for me, David said, leaning forward slightly, I have to wonder which doors you mean. Was it the door I knocked on at 3 a.m. coding after working a full-time job to pay the bills? Was it the door to my parents' basement where I lived for 2 years to save money for the company? Or maybe it was the doors of those 87 investors who turned us down. A few people in the audience murmured in agreement. Wilson shifted in his seat but remained silent. Here's what I know for certain, David continued. When we finally secured funding, it wasn't because someone wanted to check a box. It was because our technology worked. It was because we had paying customers. It was because we had solved problems that other security companies hadn't even recognized. He gestured toward the folder in Wilson's lap. Your research mentions industry analysts questioning our valuation. I invite them and you to examine our patent portfolio. 17 granted patents and 12 pending, each representing novel approaches to digital security. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. This morning before coming here, I checked our user numbers. We're now protecting over 12 million people's data, not because of my background, but because our product works better than alternatives. Wilson attempted to regain control of the conversation. No one is questioning that your product works. Mr. Carter, the question is, with all due respect, David interrupted gently but firmly, that's exactly what you've been questioning for the past several minutes. You've suggested our funding came from diversity initiatives rather than merit. You've implied our technology isn't truly innovative. You've insinuated our team might not be qualified. He gestured toward the camera. And now you're asking if doors opened for me because companies are eager to support minority-owned businesses. So yes, you are questioning whether our success is earned. The directness of David's response seemed to catch Wilson off guard. The host glanced briefly toward a producer standing off camera. Let me be clear about something, David said, his voice gaining momentum but remaining measured. The tech industry isn't doing anyone favors. Venture capital is about return on investment, not charity. Last year, less than 1% of venture funding went to Black founders. If there are all these doors supposedly flying open, the numbers certainly don't show it. Wilson tried to pivot. Those statistics do highlight the challenges. They highlight opportunity, David corrected. Untapped talent. Overlooked markets. Novel solutions born from different perspectives. Smart investors are beginning to recognize that, not because it's trendy, but because it's profitable. David spread his hands. Look, I understand the narrative you're exploring. The idea that success for someone like me must come with an asterisk. That there must be some explanation beyond the quality of our work, or the value we create. For the first time, David allowed a hint of emotion to show in his voice. But that narrative doesn't just question my company. It questions every entrepreneur who doesn't fit a certain mold. It tells the teenagers in our tech centers that no matter how innovative their ideas are, someone will always suggest they succeeded for reasons other than merit. The audience was completely silent now, many people leaning forward in their seats. So to answer your question directly, has the current climate helped us? In some ways, perhaps. Greater awareness of blind spots in the industry may have made some investors more willing to look beyond their usual networks. But that just got us in the door. What got us funded, what built our company, was creating technology that solves real problems better than anything else on the market. David gestured to the folder again. Your anonymous sources might question our valuation, but our customers, our investors, and our balance sheet tell a different story. Wilson seemed to realize the interview had slipped from his control. His practiced smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. You make some compelling points, Mr. Carter. Let's talk about... If you don't mind, David said, his tone respectful but unwavering. I'd like to add one more thing. Wilson hesitated, then nodded. Of course. Throughout this interview, we've spent more time discussing my identity than discussing the technology that protects millions of people's data. We've talked more about who I am than what my company has built or the communities we serve. David looked directly into the camera, and that's a pattern many innovators face. When we focus on why someone succeeded, rather than what they've created, we miss the innovation right in front of us. I didn't overcome obstacles to become the black guy who made it. I built technology that helps protect everyone's digital privacy. He turned back to Wilson. And if we want more innovation, which I believe we all do, we should be asking all entrepreneurs about their solutions, not just their demographics. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause. Several audience members rose to their feet. Wilson waited for the reaction to subside, his expression a mixture of surprise and professional composure. Powerful perspective, Wilson said when he could be heard again. And speaking of your technology, let's discuss the recent updates to your consumer protection app. The remainder of the interview passed without further provocative questions. Wilson steered the conversation back to safer territory. The features of CyberShield's latest products, tips for consumers to protect their data, the expansion plans for the community tech centers. David answered each question thoroughly and graciously, as if the earlier exchange had never happened. But something had shifted in the studio. The audience seemed more attentive, more engaged with the substantive discussion of digital security. Even Wilson's demeanor had changed subtly, the gotcha questions replaced with more thoughtful inquiries. As the segment drew to a close, Wilson offered his hand. David Carter, founder and CEO of CyberShield Solutions. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for having me, David replied, shaking the host's hand firmly. The red light on the camera blinked off, signaling they were clear. Wilson immediately removed his microphone and walked off the set without another word to David. A production assistant hurried over. That was unexpected, she said quietly, helping David remove his microphone. Are you all right? David nodded. I'm fine. Just not the conversation I was hoping to have. For what it's worth, she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I thought you handled it brilliantly. As David was led back through the maze of hallways toward the exit, he checked his phone. It was already lighting up with notifications, text messages, emails, social media alerts. Something was happening, but he wasn't sure what. Your car is waiting outside, the assistant informed him as they reached the exit, though you might want to prepare yourself. There are more photographers out there than when you arrived. David stepped outside into the bright morning sun, momentarily blinded after the dim studio lighting. As his eyes adjusted, he realized the assistant wasn't exaggerating. A small crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered near the studio exit. Mr. Carter, how do you feel about what just happened? One called out. Did you know Wilson was going to ambush you? Asked another. David raised a hand in polite acknowledgement but didn't stop to answer questions. His driver was waiting, the car door open. As he slid into the back seat, he turned to the assistant who had walked him out. Was the interview that bad? He asked, genuinely puzzled by all the attention. She looked at him with surprise. You don't know yet, do you? The segment went live and it's already going viral. Your response? People are calling it the most powerful moment on morning television in years. The car door closed, and as they pulled away from the studio, David tried to process what she had said. He had simply answered honestly, as he always did. He hadn't gone in looking for confrontation or hoping to create a viral moment. His phone buzzed again with an incoming call. It was Lynn, his chief operating officer. David, are you okay? Lynn's voice came through the phone, a mixture of concern and excitement. Everyone at the office is watching the clip. It's everywhere already. David adjusted his seatbelt as the car pulled into traffic. I'm fine. Just wasn't expecting the interview to go that direction. You handled it perfectly, Lynn assured him. Perfectly. Twitter is exploding. Major news sites are already posting about it. A focus on the solution is trending, David frowned. Focus on the solution? That's what people are calling it. Your line about focusing on what entrepreneurs create rather than their demographics. It's resonating with a lot of people. David gazed out the window as the city passed by. I just answered honestly, Lynn. I wasn't trying to make some grand statement. Sometimes those are the most powerful kind, Lynn replied. Listen, the PR team is getting flooded with media requests. Everyone wants to talk to you. How do you want to handle this? David thought for a moment. Let's be selective. I don't want to turn this into some kind of personal brand moment. If we do any follow-ups, let's make sure they focus on the actual issues. Digital security, tech education, expanding opportunities. Got it, Lynn said. Also, the team is planning a little celebration when you get back to the office. Just so you know, despite everything, David smiled. Tell them I appreciate it, but no fuss necessary. Too late for that, Lynn laughed. See you soon. As David ended the call, his phone immediately buzzed with another. It was his mother. Hey, Mom, he answered, his voice softening. David, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Your father and I just watched your interview. Yeah, it got a little tense, David admitted. I'm sorry if that was uncomfortable to watch. Sorry? His mother sounded surprised. Honey, we're so proud of you. The way you spoke, calm, clear, but not backing down an inch. You stood your ground with dignity. David felt a lump forming in his throat. Thanks, Mom, that means a lot. Your father's right here, nearly bursting with pride. He wants to say something. There was a shuffle as the phone changed hands. Son, his father's deep voice came through. What you said today, that's going to help a lot of people. Not just the tech stuff, but standing up for yourself that way, showing people how it's done. I was just being honest, Dad. Sometimes that's the bravest thing, his father replied. You did good, son. Real good. By the time David arrived at his company's downtown office, the video clip had spread across every major social media platform. The receptionist gave him a standing ovation as he walked through the door. In the elevator, 2 employees from the marketing department told him they'd been fielding calls from reporters all morning. When the elevator doors opened to the main office, David was met with applause from the entire floor. His team had gathered watching his interview on the large conference room screens. Lynn hurried over, tablet in hand. It's not just social media, she told him as they walked toward his office. Major news outlets are picking it up. Business publications, tech blogs, morning shows, they're all talking about it. David glanced at the conference room where people were still watching the clip. Is it really that unusual to hear someone push back on those kinds of assumptions? In that setting? On national television? With that much composure? Lynn raised an eyebrow. Yeah, it's pretty unusual. She handed him the tablet, open to a business news site. The headline read, CyberShield CEO's Masterclass in Handling Bias. Focus on the solution, not the demographics. The company's stock is up 12% since the market opened, Lynn added. But that's not even the most interesting part. What is? The emails and messages coming in from people who watched it. Young entrepreneurs, students, professionals, people from all backgrounds saying how much it meant to see that exchange. David scrolled through some of the messages Lynn had compiled. A computer science student writing that the interview gave her courage to continue in a field where she often felt like an outsider. A startup founder thanking him for articulating what he'd experienced, but never found the words to express. A venture capitalist pledging to examine her own assumptions when evaluating companies. You didn't just defend yourself, Lynn said quietly. You spoke for a lot of people who never get the chance to be heard. Before David could respond, his phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize. David Carter, he answered. Mr. Carter, this is Peter Reynolds from the National Business Council. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, David replied, though he'd never heard of the organization. I'll get right to the point, Reynolds continued. We host an annual summit on innovation and entrepreneurship. Our keynote speaker had to cancel, and after seeing your interview this morning, we'd be honored if you would take their place. It's next month in Washington. That's very kind, David said carefully. But may I ask what you'd want me to speak about? Whatever you feel is important, Reynolds replied. Though I must admit, your perspective on focusing on solutions rather than demographics was particularly compelling. We believe that message could benefit our audience greatly. David glanced at Lynn, who was watching him curiously. I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Reynolds. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. After ending the call, David explained the invitation to Lynn. You should do it, she said immediately. I don't know, David hesitated. I didn't go on that show to become a spokesperson for anything. I went to talk about our technology and our community work. And you still can, Lynn pointed out. But you've also opened a door to a different kind of conversation. One that needs to happen. Before David could reply, his assistant knocked on the door. Sorry to interrupt, she said. But there's something you should see. She handed David her phone. Open to a social media post from Bradley Wilson. It was brief. This morning's interview with David Carter has given me much to reflect on. I appreciate him challenging my assumptions and creating a teaching moment for us all. Huh, David said, genuinely surprised. Didn't expect that. There's more, his assistant added. Rise and Shine America just announced they want to do a follow-up segment focused on your community tech centers. A positive piece, they said. Over the next few weeks, the impact of the interview continued to ripple outward. David found himself balancing the newfound attention with his company's ongoing work. He accepted some speaking engagements but declined many others, careful to keep the focus on substantive issues rather than himself. 1 month after the interview, David visited the newest tech center in his old neighborhood. The building had been transformed from an abandoned community center into a vibrant hub of activity. Teenagers worked on coding projects, young adults attended professional development workshops, and community members of all ages learned basic digital literacy skills. As David walked through the main room, he noticed a group of students huddled around a computer, working intently on what looked like an app interface. "What are you building?" he asked, approaching the group. A young girl, no more than 14, looked up. Her eyes widened in recognition, but she quickly composed herself. "It's a platform to connect local businesses with neighborhood schools," she explained. "The businesses can offer internships and job shadowing, and students can showcase their projects and skills." "That's impressive," David said, genuinely intrigued. "What inspired it?" The girl glanced at her teammates, then back at David. "Well, after we saw your interview, we started talking about solutions in our own community, about how we could build something useful instead of just complaining about problems." Her words struck David deeply. This was the real impact, not the viral clips or news headlines, but young people feeling empowered to create. "Would you like to hear more about how it works?" she asked. "Absolutely," David replied, pulling up a chair. "Tell me everything." Later that evening, David sat in his apartment reflecting on the whirlwind of the past month. His phone buzzed with a text from Lynn. "Just confirmed, tech center funding secured for 5 more locations." "Board approved unanimously," David smiled. The attention from the interview had brought unexpected benefits. Increased investment, new partnerships, greater awareness of their work. But the conversation with those students today had reminded him of what truly mattered. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to Peter Reynolds of the National Business Council, accepting the keynote invitation. He knew now what he wanted to talk about. Not himself or his television moment, but the future being built in those tech centers. The innovations coming from unexpected places. The solutions being created by people who had previously been overlooked. As he worked on outlining his speech, a notification popped up on his screen. Another news article about the interview, but this one was different. It reported that 3 major venture capital firms had announced new initiatives to expand their scouting networks beyond traditional channels, specifically citing the wake-up call of his interview. Small steps, David thought, but meaningful ones. His phone rang, his parents calling for their nightly check-in. Despite all the changes of the past month, some things remained wonderfully constant. "Hey, Dad, hey, Mom," he answered warmly. "So," his father's voice came through, "tell us about your day. Any more television hosts need straightening out?" David laughed. "Not today. But I did meet some incredible kids at the new tech center who might change the world someday. Now that," his mother said, "is something worth talking about." David smiled, looking out at the city lights. "Couldn't agree more. Let me tell you about them."